The sound reached me before the door was fully open. Not shouting, not breaking glass. Something duller than that. Something that landed with weight. I stood in the doorway of that house. The house I found. The house I arranged. The house I put my daughter's name on first. And my body understood what my mind was still catching up to. My name is Fatima. I am a retired school teacher from Memphis, Tennessee. I have spent 30 years reading rooms, reading children who couldn't say what was wrong, reading parents who wouldn't. I walked into that living room and I read it in under 4 seconds. Eldridge had his back to me. Keisha was on the floor, both hands pressed to her stomach, her mouth open but no sound coming out. The kind of silence that comes after something has already happened. And Nettie, his mother, was seated in the chair by the window, legs crossed, cup in her hand. Smiling. If you've ever found yourself watching something unfold and your body goes completely still, not frozen, still, the way still is a choice, then you know exactly where I was standing. I want to stop here for just a moment. If you're watching from somewhere and you know this feeling, leave your city in the comments. You'll understand why before this story is over. I did not scream. I did not move toward Eldridge. I walked directly to Keisha, took her by the arm, and helped her up. Her weight came into me, and I felt the hard curve of her stomach against my side, and something in my chest locked shut like a door with a deadbolt. Nettie set her cup down. "It was just a joke," she said. "Nothing serious." I didn't look at her. I looked at Eldridge. He turned around slowly, the way a man turns when he hasn't decided yet what face to put on. He was still deciding when I spoke. "My own joke," I said, "is going to hit harder than this." His jaw moved, but nothing came out. Good. I wasn't speaking to the man he was pretending to be. I was speaking to the one I'd just seen. I walked Keisha out. My hand was at her back. My steps were even. The door closed behind us, and I did not look back at that house. The house I selected. The house I furnished in my mind before they ever moved in. The house that now had her fingerprints on the floor. I got her to my car. I got her inside. I turned the heat on because her hands were cold and she was shaking, and I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't what I actually wanted to do with them. We drove 2 blocks before I spoke. I asked her one question. One. The only question that mattered in that moment. "Has this happened before?" Keisha looked out the window. The streetlights were coming on. Memphis going quiet, the way it does when the afternoon gives up. She didn't answer right away, and in that pause I already knew. The way a mother knows before the words arrive. Then she said it. "It's not the first time, Mama." 4 words. 8 syllables. And everything I thought I understood about the last 2 years of my daughter's life rearranged itself into something I hadn't been allowed to see until right now. I didn't cry. I have never been a woman who leads with tears when something needs to be done. I reached into my purse. I picked up my phone. Keisha ate 4 bites of rice and fell asleep sitting up. I moved the plate, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and stood in the doorway of her old bedroom looking at my daughter. 7 months pregnant, bruised somewhere I couldn't see, sleeping in the room where she used to do homework and argue about curfew and believe the world was going to be straightforward. I went to the kitchen. I sat down. And I started thinking. Not about what he did. About what I did. About everything I built and who I built it around. When Keisha first brought Eldridge home, he was between jobs. Presentable, articulate, ambitious in the way young men are ambitious before they've been tested. Full of language, short on proof. Keisha loved him. She asked me quietly one evening if I knew anyone who could help him find something stable. Something with a future. I knew Wellington Cross. We had worked in adjacent professional circles for years, the kind of relationship built on mutual respect and the occasional phone call that actually got answered. I called him. I didn't tell Eldridge. I helped polish the application. I made the introduction. Wellington agreed to give him a look. 3 weeks later, he had an interview. 6 weeks after that, he had a position. He never knew my hands were on it. Keisha knew. She hugged me in this same kitchen and cried a little and said thank you. That was enough for me. Then the wedding came. The house was my late husband's idea before it became mine. He had always believed that if we were fortunate enough to help our daughter start life with stability, we should. After he passed, I kept that promise. I found the house before the engagement was 6 months old, a solid brick home in a good Memphis neighborhood. I contributed the down payment from savings my husband and I spent years building. Before the purchase was finalized, I paid an attorney to make certain Keisha's ownership interest was clearly documented and protected. I handed them the keys at the reception as a gift. Eldridge stood there with the keys in his hand, looking like a man who had simply been lucky. He never asked how. He never said what. He accepted it the way certain people accept things, as confirmation of what they already believed they deserved. I sat at my kitchen table and I drew it out in my mind like a ledger. Left column, what I gave. Right column, what he became inside it. The introduction. The house. The professional reputation that grew from opportunities other people opened for him. The stability that let him present himself as a provider. Every line on the left side had my name behind it. Every line on the right side had his name on top of it. That didn't make me angry. Anger is loud, and I needed to be quiet. It made me precise. It made me sit very still and understand exactly what kind of foundation I had unknowingly helped build beneath a man who used it to stand over my daughter. There was a moment at the wedding, after the toasts, during the receiving line. Eldridge leaned toward someone, a cousin of his, I think, and said it low, almost to himself, clearly not thinking I was close enough to hear. He said Keisha's family were simple people, good-hearted, simple. I was standing 3 feet away. I smiled. I said nothing. I kept moving. I had forgotten that moment until tonight. Sitting in my kitchen at 11:30, I remembered it with complete clarity. The angle of his shoulders, the small satisfied curve of his mouth. And I understood now what I was actually smiling at then. Not at his words, at the fact that a man furnished in part by my hands had just described me as simple. I opened my contacts. Wellington Cross. I had not dialed that number in 4 years. I set the phone face down on the table. I sat with it. The kitchen was quiet. Keisha was asleep down the hall. Then I picked it up and dialed. Wellington Cross picked up on the second ring. I told him my daughter had been hurt. I told him the man responsible worked at his firm. I told him I didn't need noise. I needed him to be visible. Just visible. Wellington Cross has a particular kind of presence, the kind built over decades in rooms where decisions get made and nobody raises their voice. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said 4 words. I'll handle it tomorrow. That was the call. 90 seconds. Maybe 2 minutes. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen. Then I got my keys. Keisha was asleep. Before leaving, I woke her long enough to ask one question. Do you want your things out of that house? She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. Everything that's mine. I left the hall light on, wrote 3 words on a notepad, back soon, rest, and drove to the house. Eldridge's car was gone. I still had the emergency key Keisha had given me when they moved in. I let myself inside and moved quickly and without hesitation. 3 bags, her clothing, her personal documents, her jewelry. The nursery items I had purchased myself and delivered to that house 2 months earlier, as if I were simply a grandmother preparing. I touched nothing that belonged to him. Nothing shared, nothing disputed. Only the things my daughter had asked me to bring home. I was done, before midnight. I closed the door behind me the way you close a chapter, firmly, without looking back. The next morning, Wellington Cross was already scheduled to be in that part of the city for a breakfast meeting with a client. I know what happened because Keisha pieced it together later from everything Eldridge said when he came home shaken. And Eldridge, to his own destruction, talks when he is frightened. After the meeting, Wellington made a brief stop. He knocked. Eldridge opened the door, and standing there was not an investigator, not an attorney, not anyone with a badge or a file or an accusation. Just Wellington Cross. Well-dressed, unhurried, smiling the quiet smile of a man who has never needed to raise his voice in his life. He said he was nearby and thought he would stop in for a moment. He asked about Keisha by name, how she was doing, how the pregnancy was going. He looked around the interior of that house once, briefly, the way a man looks at something he is silently taking note of. Then he said it was good to stop by, that Keisha should take care of herself. And he left. 5 minutes, maybe less. Eldridge stood in that doorway and watched Wellington Cross walk back to his car, a car that cost more than many people's annual salary. And he felt something he had no language for yet. He didn't know what it meant that this particular man had appeared at this particular door. He only knew that it meant something. He called Nettie, not Keisha, not his wife, 7 months pregnant, who he had put on the floor the day before. He called his mother. Nettie told him he was being paranoid. She told him Wellington Cross was probably just being neighborly. She told him to calm down and stop reading into things. Eldridge hung up slightly steadier. Then he unlocked the front door. He walked into a house that had been quietly, precisely emptied of every trace of a woman who had chosen to be there. Her side of the closet, bare. The bathroom shelf where her things sat, cleared. The second bedroom, where the crib had been assembled and the small dresser sat with folded newborn clothes inside, empty. Not ransacked, not dramatic. Simply gone. The way a decision looks once it's been made by someone who doesn't need to announce it. Eldridge stood in the middle of that room and understood for the first time that something had already begun. He just didn't know yet how far back it started. She started talking around 7 in the morning. I had made eggs she didn't ask for and coffee she accepted without looking up. And we sat across from each other at my kitchen table the way we used to sit when she was 16, and something had gone wrong at school. Except she was not 16. And this was not school. I didn't ask her anything. I just stayed. And after a while, she began. It started small, the way she described it, the way these things always start when the person doing it is intelligent enough to go slow. Eldridge wanted to know where she was. Then he wanted to be the one managing their shared account because he was better with numbers. Then her phone needed to be on the kitchen counter when they slept, because he said he couldn't rest otherwise. Each thing had a reason. Each reason sounded almost like love. By the time the reasons stopped making sense, she had lost the habit of checking whether they did. He disconnected her from her friends first, quietly, through scheduling conflicts and small comments that made her feel her friendships were exhausting to him. Then her colleagues. Then me, for a stretch of 8 months where she would call but never stay long on the phone, always something pulling her away. Nettie filled the space. Nettie, who had an explanation for everything he did and a way of framing his behavior that made Keisha feel her own discomfort, was the problem. Then she told me about the first pregnancy. She was 24. They had only been married 7 months. She felt the cramping on a Tuesday and Eldridge drove her to the hospital. Calm, she said, almost too calm, the kind of calm that she thought at the time was strength. They assessed her. They ran tests. Someone told her they were going to give her medication for the pain while they determined what was happening. She remembered the IV going in. She remembered asking questions. She remembered feeling exhausted. After that, the timeline became difficult for her to reconstruct. There were conversations she only half remembered. Fragments. Faces, different rooms. When she became fully aware again, she was no longer where she remembered being. A nurse told her the pregnancy had not survived. and that a procedure had been performed. She said she remembered the exact texture of the ceiling tile above her bed because she stared at it for a very long time trying to understand what had happened and how quickly everything seemed to have changed. Eldridge came in. He sat beside her, took her hand, and told her these things happen. His voice was steady. His eyes were dry. He had brought her a bottle of water. She said she opened her mouth to ask something and then closed it. She didn't know what to ask. She didn't have words for the feeling that had moved into her chest and set down roots. The feeling that something had happened around her rather than with her. There is a difference between those two things, and her body understood it even when her mind couldn't name it. She kept moving. She buried it the way you bury something when you have no proof and no one who will believe you, and a husband who holds your hand in public and monitors your phone in private. What she didn't know, what neither of us knew yet, was that someone in that hospital had documented concerns about portions of the process, notes, questions, timing, things that made more sense years later than they did at the time. Those records had been sitting untouched for 4 years. Not because anyone planned to use them, because some people write things down when something doesn't sit right with them, even when they don't yet know why. Keisha finished talking. The coffee had gone cold. I asked her one question. Who was the attending physician? She told me his name. It was not a name I recognized. It was not Dr. Louise Bramwell. But I intended to know everything about him before the week was out. I chose Dr. Louise Bramwell the same way I choose everything that matters, carefully, without announcing it. She practiced at a different hospital from the one where Keisha's first pregnancy ended. That was the first requirement. Everything else followed from there. Her record, her reputation among women in this city who talk to each other the way Memphis women do. And the fact that when I called her office and explained that my daughter needed a physician who would look at the full picture and not just the current one, the nurse who took my message said Dr. Bramwell would call me back personally. She did. That was enough. The appointment was on a Thursday morning. Keisha was quiet in the car. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone conserving something. I didn't feel it. I drove and let her have the silence. Dr. Bramwell was exactly what I needed her to be. Unhurried, precise. The kind of woman who reads a room without making a performance of it. She reviewed everything: current pregnancy, vital signs, gestational progress. Then she moved to the obstetric history, and her pen slowed. She asked Keisha to walk her through the first pregnancy. Keisha did, the same way she had told me, steady and factual until the part about waking up, and then something in her voice thinned. Bramwell listened without interrupting. When Keisha finished, Bramwell made a note, set her pen down, and reviewed the record summary Keisha had authorized the office to obtain. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted the complete file from the original hospital before finalizing her review of the prior pregnancy. She did not say anything was wrong. She did not suggest wrongdoing. She simply explained that summaries sometimes leave out context and that she preferred to work from original documentation whenever possible. Then she added something that caught my attention. There are a few areas where I'd like a clearer picture of the sequence of events, she said. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem. It just means I don't like making assumptions. She smiled slightly when she said it. The smile belonged to a woman who had spent years making decisions based on facts rather than impressions. Keisha nodded. I watched my daughter nod, and I watched her eyes, and I could see her deciding whether to ask the question sitting behind them. She waited until we were back in the car. What did she mean? Keisha said. By wanting a clearer picture? I pulled out of the parking lot. The Memphis sky was flat and gray, the kind of February gray that sits on the city like a held breath. I told her the truth. I said I didn't know exactly what Bramwell had seen. I said that doctors who take their work seriously usually want complete records before drawing conclusions. I said that whatever questions she had, I intended to find the answers. And I said she didn't have to carry the wondering anymore. That was mine to do now. Keisha looked out the window for a long time. Then she said it. Quietly. The way you say something you have been holding in your body for years and finally found the nerve to put into the air. Mama, I don't think I lost that baby on my own. I kept my eyes on the road. My hands stayed where they were on the wheel. I did not gasp, did not reach for her, did not make it about my reaction. Because this moment was not mine. It was hers. The first time she had said that out loud to another living person, and it needed to land in silence, not in my arms. I know, baby, I said. That was all. 2 words. And we drove the rest of the way home without speaking. And the quiet between us was different from any quiet we had shared before. It had weight to it now. It had direction. That night, after Keisha went to bed, my phone rang. Eldridge. His name on the screen like a question he hadn't decided how to ask yet. I looked at it. I let it ring. I set it face down on the table. He could wait. He called at 7:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I wrote it down. That is what I do now. That is what I have been doing since the night I left his house with my daughter. Writing things down. Exactly as they happen. Exactly as they are said, with the time noted and the date above it. 30 years of teaching children taught me that the version of events people remember later is almost never the version that actually occurred. I decided early that I would not be the person without a record. I answered on the 3rd ring. Fatima. He used my name the way people use names when they want to signal that they are being reasonable. I just need to know that Keisha is all right. She's resting, I said. Is she coming home? She'll be in touch when she's ready. A pause. I could hear him deciding something on the other end of the line. Then, have you spoken to anyone about any of this? I let that question sit in the air for exactly 2 seconds. Then I told him I had to go, and I hung up. I opened my notebook. I had started it the night I brought Keisha home. A plain composition book, nothing special, sitting on my kitchen table where I could reach it easily. I wrote down what I had seen when I walked into that house, the time, what he was doing, where Nettie was sitting, the exact words she used, the exact words I used. I wrote down everything because I am a woman who has spent 30 years watching what people say and what they actually mean, and understanding that the distance between those 2 things is where the truth lives. This morning, I wrote down his 3 questions in the order he asked them. Where is she? Is she coming home? Have you spoken to anyone? Then I wrote 1 observation underneath them, separate from the rest. He did not ask about the baby. Not once. Not at the beginning of the call to establish concern. Not at the end as an afterthought. A man whose pregnant wife had been absent from their home for 2 days did not ask, in any form, whether the child she was carrying was all right. I closed the notebook and put it back on the table and sat with that for a while. By mid-morning, Keisha was eating properly for the first time, and we did not discuss Eldridge. We discussed the baby, names, preferences, the particular way the child had been kicking at night that Keisha demonstrated by placing my hand on the side of her stomach. I focused on that. I let the morning be the morning. That evening, Wellington Cross called. He was measured the way he always is. No drama, no inflation. He told me that Eldridge had spent the better part of 2 days asking colleagues at the firm quiet questions. Whether Wellington had been involved in any personnel reviews recently, whether anyone had seen him in a professional capacity outside the office, whether there had been any unusual activity at the senior level. Wellington said his assistant had flagged it to him that afternoon. He said he was calling me because he thought I should know. I thanked him. I told him the questions Eldridge was asking were going to do more damage to Eldridge than anything either of us needed to arrange. I asked Wellington for one favor. Don't do anything yet, I said. I'm not finished. Wellington Cross was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Understood." That was all. I hung up and opened my notebook to a fresh page. Eldridge was frightened. Frightened men move. Frightened men ask questions they shouldn't ask of people they shouldn't ask. And every move he made from here was going to be in my notebook before he realized anyone was watching. Dr. Bramwell called on a Wednesday morning and asked if we could come in that afternoon. Not a routine check. Not a scheduling matter. The way she said it, measured, unhurried, but with something underneath, told me the records had arrived and she had read them and she needed us sitting across from her when she said what she had to say. We were there by 2:00. Bramwell's office was quiet. She had the file on her desk, but she didn't open it immediately. She looked at Keisha first, directly, the way a doctor looks at a patient when she is deciding how much that patient can hold. And then she opened it. She walked through it plainly. No clinical distance. No unnecessary softening. The record from the first hospital covered the admission, the assessment, and the sedation administered for what was documented as pain management. She paused there. She said the sequence was difficult to reconstruct with certainty from the materials she received. Some portions of the record were complete, others were not. The sedation appeared to have been administered before any completed consent documentation could be found in the file provided to her, although she was careful to note that absence from the file did not automatically mean the document never existed. Keisha's hands were still in her lap. Bramwell continued. The file also contained a notation from the attending nurse documenting communication from a family member regarding the condition of the pregnancy. The entry was time-stamped and signed. By itself, the notation did not establish wrongdoing. But when she looked at it alongside the timeline reflected elsewhere in the record, it raised questions she could not answer from the documentation alone. There was no signed consent form from Keisha in the materials Bramwell received. Not an initial one. Not a delayed one. Not a corrected version added later. If one existed, it had not been included in what was provided for review. Bramwell turned to a second notation, entered by the same nurse in the recovery record. The patient regained partial consciousness and asked what had happened. The question was documented. The record did not clearly indicate when that discussion ultimately occurred. The room was very quiet. Bramwell set the file down and folded her hands on top of it. "What I'm looking at raises serious concerns," she said. She chose her next words carefully. "I wasn't there. I don't know everything that occurred that day. These records do not tell me what happened. What they tell me is that there are significant unanswered questions about the consent process, the timing of events, and whether proper procedures were followed." Keisha did not move. Bramwell continued. "Those questions need to be reviewed by people whose job it is to review them. That is not a conclusion. It's a concern. But it's a concern serious enough that I am professionally obligated to report it to the hospital's compliance office for further evaluation." She paused. "If the documentation accurately reflects what happened, there could be substantial legal and professional consequences for the people involved. Determining that, however, is not my role." The file sat between them, years of uncertainty compressed into a few sheets of paper. Bramwell looked at Keisha. "You also have the right to request a formal review yourself and to speak with a patient advocate about your options." Then she stopped talking, and she waited. I did not speak. I had things moving through me that I was not going to put into that room. I kept them behind my eyes and I waited alongside Bramwell in the silence. Keisha looked at the file on the desk. She looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that has confirmed what your body told you years ago when your mind had no proof and no permission to believe itself. Then she said it quietly, almost to herself. "I knew. I always knew something was wrong. Not anger, not collapse, something older and heavier than both. The specific grief of a woman who had been right about something terrible for 4 years and had no one to tell. I reached over and put my hand over hers. I did not say anything. Bramwell looked at Keisha and asked her one question. "Do you want to pursue this formally?" Keisha turned and looked at me, and then she nodded. The knock came on a Saturday morning. I knew before I reached the door. There are knocks that announce and knocks that negotiate, and this one had the particular rhythm of someone who has rehearsed what comes after it. I opened the door, and there was Nettie Redmond, pressed clothes, good earrings, hands folded in front of her like a woman arriving for a meeting she had called herself. The symmetry was not lost on me. She had shown up at my door unannounced, the same way I had shown up at hers. Except when I arrived unannounced, my daughter was on the floor. "Fatima," she said. "I was hoping we could talk." I stepped back and let her in. I put the kettle on. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had built my ledger, written my notes, dialed Wellington Cross, and she arranged herself and began. She was composed and she was prepared, and she had clearly decided on her approach before she left her house. Eldridge was under significant stress, she said. The demands of his position, the pressure of an expanding family, the way these things sometimes came out wrong in a marriage. Keisha had always been sensitive. She said it gently, as if sensitivity were a medical condition requiring accommodation. Marriages required compromise from both sides. And a child, she said, setting her cup down for emphasis, needed both parents in the same home. She did not mention what I saw when I walked into that house. She did not mention Wellington Cross. She did not mention the hospital, the records, or the word that had been sitting in a file for 4 years. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and every sentence was a variation of the same request. Come back. Be quiet. Call it something other than what it is. I listened to all of it. I refilled her cup once. When she finished, I told her I appreciated her making the trip, that Keisha was being well looked after, and that Keisha would be in touch with Eldridge when she was ready. I smiled the way I smile when I am giving nothing away. Nettie left with her back straight and her composure intact, believing she had moved something. She had moved nothing. I closed the door and opened my notebook. I added a new section, not for what Nettie said, because none of it was new information, but because the visit itself was data. Eldridge had sent his mother before he sent an attorney. That sequence told me exactly where he believed his exposure was. He thought this was a domestic matter, something that could be resolved through family channels and careful language, and a mother with good posture. He did not yet know that his exposure was in a hospital file 4 years old and already flagged by a physician with an obligation to act. He still thought this was about a marriage. 3 days later, something changed. I did not witness it. What I know comes from what happened afterward. Nettie called my phone that evening. I did not answer. Then she called again, and later, a third time. I sat in my kitchen and listened to it ring and thought about what could make a woman who never repeated herself reach for the phone 3 times in one night. Weeks later, pieces of it became clearer. Eldridge had spoken to her. Not in the way people confess in movies, not cleanly, not completely. He had been frightened. He had been talking too much. He had been trying to explain things that would have been better left unexplained. By the end of the conversation, Nettie understood enough to stop defending him with the certainty she once had. She had spent 20 minutes in my kitchen telling me Keisha was sensitive. Now she was carrying questions of her own. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. I wrote a heading at the top. What he told his mother. Wellington called on a Tuesday evening while I was washing dishes. I dried my hands and answered, and he got straight to it the way he always does. No preamble, no softening. He said Eldridge's questions at work had traveled further than Eldridge intended. A colleague had mentioned the conversation during a separate HR discussion. Not maliciously, not deliberately. Simply the way people mention things when they are in a room, and one thought connects to another. The pattern of questions caught attention. That attention led to a routine review. Nothing unusual about the process itself. When an employee begins making repeated inquiries outside normal channels, people take a closer look. That is simply what organizations do. What they found was not misconduct, not fraud, not some hidden secret buried in a personnel file. What they found was a pattern. Repeated questions about senior leadership, repeated attempts to determine whether discussions were taking place above his level, repeated conversations with colleagues about matters unrelated to his role. Individually, none of it violated policy. Taken together, it raised concerns about judgment and professional conduct. The matter was escalated for administrative review, not terminated. Not yet, but flagged. His colleagues knew. In a firm like that one, administrative review has a particular visibility. People notice the meetings that stop including you. They notice the shifted tone. They notice. Wellington said it to me plainly. He had not requested the review. He had not directed it. He had not spoken to anyone in HR about Eldridge. Eldridge had done this entirely by himself. His own fear had made him conspicuous, and his own conspicuousness had drawn attention to behavior nobody had paid much attention to before. I wrote it down exactly as Wellington said it. Then he told me the other thing. Eldridge had been telling people at work that his wife's family was interfering in his marriage. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly. The way you build a story before the real story arrives. Positioning himself as a reasonable man burdened by unreasonable in-laws. Constructing a version of events in which he was the one being acted upon. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote a heading. What a frightened man does before questions arrive. Underneath it, I wrote what Wellington had just told me, word for word, with the date and the time. A man who begins building explanations before anyone asks for them is usually anticipating something. He just doesn't know what shape it will take when it arrives. I thanked Wellington. We ended the call. The following morning, I took Keisha to Dr. Bramwell for her regular prenatal appointment. Bramwell moved through the examination with her usual efficiency, measurements, heartbeat, positioning. Then she turned the monitor screen so Keisha could see and told her the baby was healthy. Strong heartbeat. Good weight for gestational age. Everything where it should be. Keisha put her hand over her mouth and held it there. I watched my daughter look at her child on that screen, and I thought about everything she had survived to reach this moment. And I thought about how, despite all of it, she was here. Bramwell gave us a moment. Then she said there was one additional update. The compliance review concerning the prior hospital records had been formally processed. A patient advocate would be contacting Keisha within the week to explain her rights, answer questions, and discuss the procedures available to her should she decide to move forward. Keisha lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at me. The baby was healthy, and something that had existed for years as a private uncertainty was now being examined by people whose responsibility was to determine what had actually happened. Carol called on a Thursday morning and introduced herself in the unhurried way of someone who has delivered difficult information before and learned that the pace of the delivery matters. She explained the process clearly. Keisha's rights under Tennessee law. What the compliance review meant procedurally. What a formal complaint looked like. What it triggered. And what Keisha could expect at each stage. She did not rush. She did not use language designed to minimize or inflate. She simply laid it out, and then she asked Keisha if she had questions before they scheduled a time to meet. Keisha said she didn't have questions. She said she was ready. We met Carol at the hospital 2 days later, a conference room, nothing clinical about it, just a table and chairs and a woman with a notepad, who looked at Keisha like she was the only person in the room. Which she was. That was the point. I sat beside my daughter and I did not speak. Not once. This was not my testimony to give. I had carried things for Keisha in the weeks since I brought her home. The logistics, the documentation, the calls, the decisions made at kitchen tables while she slept. But this room belonged to her. These words were hers. I folded my hands in my lap and I stayed still and I let my daughter speak for herself for the first time since any of this began. She spoke for 40 minutes. She was precise. She was steady. She went in chronological order without being prompted, and she did not soften the parts that needed to be said plainly. I watched her and I thought, this is who she has always been underneath everything he layered on top of her. This is the woman he spent 2 years trying to make smaller. When she finished, Carol thanked her and made her notes and told us what would happen next. The original attending physician had retired 18 months prior but remained actively licensed. The complaint would be reviewed through the hospital's established process and forwarded to the appropriate regulatory bodies if warranted. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners could become involved depending on the outcome of that review. Carol was careful with her wording. Questions had been raised. Documentation would be examined. Decisions would be made by the people authorized to make them. She also explained that if the review uncovered evidence suggesting legal violations, the matter could eventually be referred to law enforcement authorities. That determination would not be made by her office. Carol never used dramatic language. She never told Keisha what conclusion to reach. She simply explained the process and the rights available to her within it. Keisha walked out of that building and stood in the parking lot and took a long breath of February air. She told me she felt lighter. Not happy. She was careful to say that. Not relieved, exactly. She said it felt like setting down something she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it wasn't part of her body. I understood that. Several weeks later, Wellington called with something he had heard through the firm's legal network. The original attending physician's attorney had contacted the hospital's legal office, requesting that portions of the record be reviewed for accuracy. The attorney questioned whether certain nursing notes fully reflected the circumstances surrounding the admission and wanted the documentation examined. I sat with that for a moment. The notation was time-stamped. It was signed. It had been entered into the record years earlier by a nurse who had documented what she observed at the time. The hospital logged the request, preserved it, and added it to the review file. The attorney had not changed anything, but he had drawn attention back to a record that was already being examined. That evening, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I answered. A man identified himself as an attorney. He said he was calling on behalf of Eldridge Redmond. I wrote the number down. I wrote the time. I closed my notebook and sat very still. Eldridge had found himself a lawyer, which meant he finally understood this was no longer a domestic matter. I heard about the termination from Wellington that same afternoon. He did not editorialize. He said the administrative review had concluded and Eldridge had been let go that morning in a standard exit meeting. Wellington was not present. No one from senior leadership was present. It was processed the way these things are processed when the outcome is already determined. Quietly, paperwork across a table, building access revoked before he reached the parking lot. I wrote the date in my notebook and closed it. What happened next, I did not witness. But I have spent enough years understanding how people behave when the structure around them begins to fail that I can reconstruct it clearly enough. Eldridge went home, not to my home, to his. The house on the street I had selected, in the neighborhood I had researched, with the ownership protections I had paid to put in place long before I understood why they might someday matter. He walked into rooms I had helped choose and sat with furniture I had helped select, and he began, probably for the first time with real urgency, to calculate what he actually owned. The job was gone. That was the first column. The house, he lived in it. His name was attached to it. But Keisha's ownership interest remained exactly where it had always been. He could not sell it. He could not borrow against it. He could not use it as leverage or collateral or exit strategy without her cooperation. And her cooperation was not something he had any right to assume. The second column was very short. His attorney called him that evening. I know the shape of that conversation not because I was told directly, but because of what followed from it. The way a stone thrown into still water tells you exactly where it landed, by the rings that move outward from the center. The attorney told him the hospital review was no longer confined to internal compliance questions. Additional inquiries had begun. Records were being examined. Statements were being requested. People whose jobs involved determining whether procedures had been followed were now looking at things that had sat untouched for years. Eldridge's first response, I imagine, was the assault. What Fatima saw, what could be testified to, what a witness account meant in a courtroom. That was the thing he had been bracing for. That was the exposure he thought he understood. His attorney told him there was something else, something older. The attorney said he needed to review certain hospital records before he could characterize the situation fully, and that Eldridge should not discuss the matter with anyone until they had spoken again in person. Eldridge sat with that. He had believed the first pregnancy was settled, finished, a thing that existed only in his own memory and Keisha's buried feeling, and the quiet of a hospital room 4 years ago. He had never considered that questions left unanswered could survive that long. He had never considered that a notation entered into a record years earlier could sit unnoticed until somebody with no personal stake in the outcome read it and stopped at exactly the right page. He spent that night reconstructing a timeline he had believed was unreachable. It was not unreachable. It had never been unreachable. It had simply been waiting. His phone lit up sometime after 10. Nettie. He looked at her name on the screen and did not move. It rang out. She called again, then a third time, then a fourth. He sat on the couch in the house that wasn't really his and held the phone in both hands, and did not answer and did not set it down. He had told his mother enough to make her call 4 times. He had not told her enough to know what to say if he picked up. I did not see Nettie for 11 days after Eldridge stopped answering her calls. What I knew about those 11 days came to me the way things come to a woman who has lived her whole life in one city and raised a child in it and taught other people's children in it for 3 decades. Through the texture of the place itself. Memphis does not gossip the way outsiders imagine. It observes, it files, it remembers. And the women in it who have lived long enough have a way of communicating what they know without saying very much at all. What they knew was this. Keisha Redmond was at her mother's house. Eldridge Redmond was alone in that house on the other side of the city. A man named Wellington Cross, whose name carried weight in certain professional circles, had been connected to something at the firm where Eldridge worked. And now there was talk, the careful kind, about attorneys and hospital records and the Shelby County DA's office. Nobody had the complete picture. But women who have watched enough marriages and enough men, and enough of what gets hidden inside both know the shape of a thing long before all the details arrive. They recognized this shape. They had seen it before, in other forms, in other families. They said very little. They watched. Nettie sat inside all of that and said nothing to anyone. She went to her church on Sunday. I heard this from a woman who sings in the same choir. She sat in her usual pew and she sang, and she shook hands afterward, and she said nothing about Eldridge or Keisha or any of it. She went to her neighbor's porch on Tuesday evening the way she always did, and she drank sweet tea, and she listened to other people talk, and she contributed nothing that mattered. She went to her Thursday lunch. She was present everywhere and absent in the way that counts. I did not reach out to her. I had nothing to say to Nettie Redmond that needed to be said now. Whatever she was carrying, she had picked it up herself when her son sat across from her and told her about a decision he made in a hospital 4 years ago. That was between her and what she knew. On a Wednesday afternoon, I took Keisha to her prenatal appointment. We were in the corridor outside the elevator on the way back from Bramwell's office when I saw her. Nettie was walking toward the chapel. She was dressed plainly, no performance in it, no good earrings, no rehearsed posture. She was just a woman walking down a hospital corridor toward a quiet room because she needed somewhere to be that wasn't her house. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. We stopped. Neither of us spoke. Keisha was beside me, but Nettie's eyes went to mine and stayed there, and I looked back at her, and I read her face, the way I have read faces my entire professional life, carefully, completely, without projection. There was nothing defensive in it. No version of the woman who had sat at my kitchen table with good posture and rehearsed sentences. No argument being assembled behind her eyes. Just the face of a woman who had finally stopped fighting what she knew and was left with only the weight of it. We stood there for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she walked past us toward the chapel, and I walked my daughter to the elevator, and we went home. That evening, I opened my notebook. I found the section labeled, "What?" he told his mother. I read through it once. Then I drew a single line through the heading. Nettie was not an obstacle anymore. She was not a variable. She was simply a woman in a chapel asking whatever she needed to ask of whatever she believed was listening. I closed the notebook. I did not reopen that section. She was done, and I had more to do. The filings became public on a Thursday morning. The first involved what I witnessed with my own eyes, my son-in-law striking my pregnant daughter in the house I selected. On the floor, she fell to. The second concerned the events surrounding Keisha's first pregnancy 4 years earlier, the hospital records, the missing consent documentation, the nurse's notation, and the formal reviews that had followed. What had once existed only as a feeling inside my daughter was now sitting inside official files being examined by people whose job was to determine exactly what had happened. By noon, those filings were part of the public record. I did not post anything. I did not call anyone. I made coffee and I sat at my kitchen table and I let Memphis do what Memphis does. By evening, it had begun to travel, not through gossip, not through anything I touched, but through the filings themselves. People in Eldridge's professional and social circles knew how to access those records, and some of them did. The colleagues who had listened to him describe his wife's family as interfering, who had nodded with polite sympathy while he constructed his preemptive version of events, now had another version sitting beside it. The two did not reconcile. A man who frames himself as a victim before anyone has formally challenged him looks, in retrospect, exactly like what he was. A man who knew something was coming and tried to get ahead of it. The distance some of his colleagues put between themselves and him after that was not dramatic. It was simply noticeable. I heard pieces of it through Wellington, not details, just the outline. The way certain professional doors begin to close when a man's name becomes attached to court filings, investigations, and questions nobody wants connected to their organization. Quietly, without announcement, without anyone needing to explain why. That evening, I sat with Keisha on the front porch. The neighborhood was doing what Memphis neighborhoods do at the end of a winter day, going still by degrees, porch lights coming on one at a time. The particular quiet that settles when the city decides the day is finished. We sat in it, and we did not talk about attorneys or filings or any of it. We just sat. I thought about her at 24, lying in a hospital room with a ceiling she stared at because she had nothing else to look at while she tried to understand what had happened. Asking a question into a room where nobody answered. Carrying that feeling for 4 years without proof and without permission to trust what her own instincts were telling her. She had something now that she had not possessed then. Questions documented by people other than herself. A process moving forward. The beginning of answers. I did not say any of this aloud. Some things do not need to be said to be understood between two people sitting close enough to share the same cold air. We went inside when the stars came out. Several weeks later, Keisha's attorney called. Eldridge's legal team had challenged portions of the medical record review process. The arguments were procedural and technical, the kind lawyers make when they are trying to narrow what can and cannot be considered as a matter moves forward. I listened without alarm. The challenge did not stop the review. The nurse's notation remained in the file. The absence of a signed consent form remained part of the record. The recovery room entry remained exactly where it had always been, and the physician's attorney's request to revisit portions of the documentation remained preserved alongside everything else. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was withdrawn. Nothing became easier for the people whose names were attached to those records. Eldridge's attorney had not closed any doors. If anything, he had confirmed how much attention was now being paid to what sat behind them. Keisha's water broke at 4 in the morning. I had been sleeping lightly the way I have slept every night since she came home. One level below fully awake, the part of me that raised her still listening even after 30 years. I heard her in the hallway, and I was up before she knocked on my door. We did not panic. We moved. Bag already packed. Car already positioned in the driveway the way I had arranged it 2 weeks prior. Some things you prepare for without announcing the preparation. Dr. Bramwell met us at the hospital. The labor was long, 11 hours, which Keisha handled with the same steadiness she had shown in Carol's conference room, in Bramwell's office, in every room that had asked something hard of her these past months. I stayed beside her. I did not coach or narrate or fill the room with my own feeling. I held her hand when she needed it held, and I stepped back when she needed space, and I let her do what her body knew how to do. The baby arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon. A girl. Bramwell placed her in Keisha's arms, and the room shifted in the way rooms shift when something irrevocable has happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a change in the quality of the air, a before and an after, that you can feel in your chest before your mind catches up to it. Keisha looked at her daughter and did not speak for a long time. She just looked. The baby was small and certain and completely herself, the way newborns are before the world has had any time with them. She had Keisha's mouth. She had a look of absolute authority that I recognized immediately. Bramwell stepped out. A nurse completed her work quietly and left us. I sat in the chair beside the bed, and Keisha held her daughter, and we stayed in that for a while without disturbing it. When Keisha's eyes grew heavy, I reached over and she transferred the baby into my arms with the careful trust of a woman who has just done the hardest thing she has ever done and needs 30 minutes of rest before she can do anything else. I held that child. I did not think about Eldridge. I made a decision not to let him occupy a single second of this room, this light, this weight in my arms. What I thought about was Keisha at 24, a hospital room, a ceiling, a question she asked that nobody answered. I thought about everything that had been arranged to make sure she never had this. I thought about the distance between that room and this one, and how far my daughter had traveled to get here, and how much of that distance she had covered carrying something nobody should have had to carry alone. The baby made a small sound and settled. Later that afternoon, Keisha's civil attorney called my phone. I had stepped into the hallway to let Keisha rest, and told me the trial date had been set. She also told me Eldridge's attorney had been in contact. The documentary record, the nurse's notation, the absent consent form, the amendment request, Fatima's eyewitness testimony, had left his client with very little to argue against. A plea agreement was being discussed. The civil proceedings were advancing alongside the criminal track. The house would be resolved in those proceedings. He would leave it with nothing he had not carried in before the day I made one phone call, and his entire constructed life began to answer for itself. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out over Memphis, the city that had watched all of this and said nothing and known everything. My phone showed one message: Wellington Cross. 3 words. Heard. The news. Good. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to my daughter. The call came on a Tuesday morning while the baby was sleeping. Keisha's attorney, brief, professional, the kind of delivery that comes from delivering outcomes to families who have been waiting a long time. She told me the matter had been resolved. The assault case had ended with a plea agreement. The civil matter had been settled. Keisha would receive damages. The house would transfer fully to her as part of that settlement. By the time everything concluded, Eldridge had already lost, in the order that things fell, the job, the professional reputation, the marriage, the house, and finally, his freedom. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat with it for a moment, not long, just enough to let it settle into its proper place. Then I got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. The same way I have made it every morning for 30 years. Same pot, same measure, same unhurried process, while Memphis comes alive outside my window. Some routines are not habits. They are proof that you are still standing. I thought about the night I walked into that house, the unlocked door, the sound before I saw anything, that dull landing weight that my body understood before my mind did. Eldridge is back to me, Keisha on the floor with both hands on her stomach, and Nettie in the chair by the window, cup in hand, smiling. I had stood in that doorway and made a promise out loud to a man who looked at me and saw a retired school teacher from Memphis. Simple people, he had said once, 3 feet away from me, not knowing I was close enough to hear. He had looked at everything I built and seen the furniture and the address and the stability and believed it had arrived because men like him attract these things. He had not seen me at all. That was his first mistake. I thought about what I had tried to give him. The introduction, the opportunity, the house that my husband and I wanted our daughter to have. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over something you have examined many times and keep finding the same answer in. I did not regret any of it. Not one piece. I built it for Keisha. Her happiness was always the point, that the same things later became the places where questions were asked. The job, the house, the relationships. Was not something I planned. Life simply has a way of circling back to the foundations people build for themselves. And Eldridge had spent years building on ground that could not hold him. The coffee finished. I poured a cup. From the next room I could hear Keisha, a quiet sound. The specific hush of a woman nursing a newborn in the early morning. The world reduced to that one small weight and that one steady rhythm. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter with her daughter, and I held my cup, and I did not go in. Some moments are not mine to enter. Some things you witness from the threshold, and that is exactly enough. I turned back to the window. Memphis, outside. Low, winter light on the rooftops. The city that has known me my whole life and watched all of this without saying a word, and remembered every detail anyway. I picked up my coffee. I did not smile. I simply stood. Some jokes take time to land. His lasted 1 second. Mine was a promise made in a doorway. What happened afterward was not revenge. It was consequence. And by the time it reached him, there was nothing left to laugh about. Not for him. Not for anyone who stood in that room the day my daughter was on the floor. I did not take that man's life apart. He did that himself. I simply refused to let him do the same thing to my daughter.